I met a man at a crossroad. I don't consider myself a religious man, but lately, I have been thinking about what comes next. Maybe it's the fact that I just turned 41. Or it might be that I watched my father wither away physically and mentally to nothing last year before his body finally expired days before my birthday. I started drinking a lot at first, as a lot of people do when something like that happens. I had been bar hopping one night and honestly was starting to think about suicide as a genuine solution. I was walking along the rural road that would take me home when I got hit by a driver who didn't see me. I don't remember much beyond the initial impact until I woke up in traction, with what looked like an erector set around each of my legs. The pain I was in was immense and varied from fiery from my feet to hips to a deep soreness up into my torso and neck. I wasn't awake very long, and that trend continued for a few days on end. I barely ate, not feeling strong enough to swallow for a little more than a week. I was still held together by the pins and rods in my hips and legs when I went to court with the man who had hit me the first time. He had apparently been drinking as well, which, in the eyes, took all of the responsibility off of my shoulders. It didn't alleviate the guilt I felt form like a stone in my chest when I heard the charges he was being hit with, however. I didn't speak up because I had been advised not to earlier that morning. I was wheeled into the elevator and transported back to the hospital. Time faded Eno that barely awake, half asleep stayed again for a long time. The days blended into weeks, and as my body healed, I started being allowed more time out of my room. Of course, I was in a wheelchair and had a nurse or my father pushing me around, but I was enjoying the bursts of freedom. I did not enjoy what came a week after I was discharged. I still had a lot of metal framework holding my lower extremities, but some of the stabilizing bars had been removed. I was also enrolled in physical therapy. Trying to support my own weight was a brand new level of hell that even Dante's Inferno didn't describe. It took me months before I could stand on my own, and every time a set of the pins protruding from my flesh were removed, I would hit a setback. I began to believe that I would never walk again without assistance. That led me down another dark mental and emotional hole. I once again began to contemplate suicide, and was sitting on the recliner that I still had to use as a bed, trying to think of a reason to live when I was struck by the sudden urge to leave the house. I maneuvered my body into the manual wheelchair and started toward the front door. "Is everything okay?" My mother's voice floated down the hall, sounding more concerned than anything. "I'm fine, just going around the block," I called back. "Be careful out there," she said. I was already rolling forward when I replied, "I always am." I opened the door and rolled through, pulling the door closed as my momentum carried me down the ramp to the sidewalk. I started away from the house, pausing at the corner to pull a bottle of pain medication from my pocket, shaking a single pill into the palm of my hand, tossing that into my mouth, swallowing it with the aid of a couple of gulps from the water bottle hanging from the armrest of my wheelchair. I wheeled across the street and around a corner, just needing to clear my head, all of them negative thoughts piling up. As I rolled along, I breathed deeply, absorbing the crisp evening air as I went on my way. I turned another corner onto a busier street, people moving between restaurants and bars in small knots. I maneuvered through the crowd and into one of the bars and up to the counter. "How can I help you?" the square-jawed man behind the bar asked. "Can I get a Coke and an order of chicken wings?" I asked, not wanting to mix alcohol with the opiates already dissolving in my stomach. He nodded and took the debit card that I offered, returning with my drink first. I sipped the sweet beverage and glanced around while I waited for my food. When my order arrived, I ate quickly. I had been hoping being out of the house would help me feel better, but my depression lingered and my thoughts turned dark again. Eventually, I made my way back outside, turning the opposite direction from my home. I didn't feel like being cooped up, but I did want to be alone. I continued propelling myself along the road, even when the sidewalk and buildings gave way to two-lane blacktop. I didn't turn around, still struggling with thoughts of suicide. I had to stop after nearly half an hour, my arms growing weak and tired. I considered calling one of my parents for a ride, but decided to just rest until I felt good enough to roll my way back to town. It was getting late as I rolled through a small crossroad I hadn't noticed before. I slowed down, intending to rest again when I heard someone whistling to my left. I turned my head, and squinted into the gloom, the lack of streetlights making it difficult to see anything. I heard footsteps echoing in the quiet night around me, and after another minute or so, I saw a shape approaching. It was a tall figure, carrying some kind of case, walking toward me. "Hello?" I called out as the whistling drew closer. "Hello there," a voice responded. The figure drew closer, and I could make out the guitar case he carried in his left hand, as well as the way he was dressed. It struck me as odder than the fact he was carrying an instrument, because he was wearing a very old-fashioned suit, complete with a wide-brimmed hat. The face I saw in the flicker of a match flame as he lit a cigarette seemed familiar to me. After a few minutes of silence, the stranger spoke up. "What are you doing all the way out here?" he asked, exhaling a cloud of vapor into the night air. "I just needed time to think. I could ask you the same thing," I replied. I shivered and shrunk down in my jacket. Suddenly, it was much colder than it had been. He laughed a little at my last comment. "I suppose you could," he admitted. He took another long drag of the cigarette and walked to the side of the road near me, then set down the guitar case, opening it and pulling the instrument from inside. "You mind if I play a little bit?" he requested, the glow of his cigarette's ember glowing brighter as he took another puff. "Don't mind me," I said, already getting the urge to start wheeling my way down the road. I was just about to start doing just that when the man's fingers plucked the strings, the tune once again vaguely familiar, as if I had heard it before. I sat there, huddled in the dark, listening to the man play without singing for what seemed like hours. He stubbed out the cigarette hanging from his lips and tipped his hat back to allow the moon to illuminate his face as he looked up at me from his seat on the ground. "If you could have anything right now, what would it be?" The question hung heavy between us, the gravity of it seeming to bend space and time as I gave it real consideration. "To be able to get out of this chair and walk home," I finally said, only half serious. The man laughed again. "Is that all you want?" he taunted, standing and replacing his guitar in the case. "Yeah, it would be nice. Physical therapy doesn't seem to be helping much," I blurted out as the stranger dusted off his pants and reached out and touched the back of my hand. "Then get up and do it," he told me. "Yeah, right?" I scoffed. "Try it," he pressured, lighting another cigarette. I got angry and decided I was going to prove my point. I reached down to move my leg with my hands, and to my shock, I felt it. I pushed myself out of the chair and stood on my own power. I stared, wide-eyed at the stranger. He said nothing, simply picked up his case and started walking away, whistling the same tune he had been strumming before. I walked home, and in the morning, my parents went to the doctor with me. I was x-rayed and given reflex tests, and the doctors entered the room, informing us that all of the damage in my lower extremities had healed. They hooked me up to a bunch of machines and inserted a stent into the bend of my arm, dripping fluids into my body. The next step was preparing me for surgery. I blushed when the nurse began shaving my legs, feeling vulnerable and exposed in that moment. Thankfully, it was a short process, and soon I was floating in the sedative sea. When I woke, the faces of my parents were the first that I saw. "How are you feeling?" my father asked. "A little sore and dizzy, but okay," I mumbled in reply. Due to the drugs, I can't recall the entire conversation, but I remember being excited before dropping back into sleep. They kept me for observation for a few days, the doctors calling my healing a miracle multiple times. Walking was strange without all of the extra support, but I was able to walk around normally again within a week. I went about trying to rebuild my life, using public transportation to apply for jobs. I got a few interviews within a month, and was beginning to feel optimistic about the future for the first time since before I got hit. It took time, but I eventually did land a job and had been working for a few weeks. That's when I began to have the dizzy spells. They were bouts of extreme vertigo that would come out of the blue and send me reeling on my feet or tilting in my seat. I tried to ignore it for a while until a particularly bad episode occurred in front of my mother. She rushed me to the emergency room, but they found nothing wrong with me. I kept pushing on, living my life. Weeks again bled into months, and the episodes came and went, some days seeming worse than others. More recently, I have been experiencing sleep paralysis. I wake cold, alone in my bed at night. I feel too heavy to move, and that's when I see it, the shadowy thing in the corner of the room. Sometimes, I even think I can hear him whistling that strangely familiar tune. Then I actually wake up, a feeling of cold, creeping dread settling into my chest and cold sweat on my face. When I glance in the corner, there's nothing there but darkness, and there is no melody in the air. I'm always a little bit relieved at that. I usually can't get back to sleep, and as a result, I have taken to going for a run early in the morning. It was during one of these jogs that I saw something strange for the first time. It was just a fleeting glimpse of a figure in the corner of my vision, and when I paused to look at it directly, it disappeared. The dizzy spells continued during this time as well, but were becoming less and less frequent. The hallucinations replaced them gradually. At first, it was just flickering movements and distortions in light and space around me, and again, I kept it to myself. That is until the warping effect started happening to people around me. That got me in trouble once or twice, but luckily I landed in the hospital instead of jail. They gave me pills and kept me for 72 hours under observation, and when they let me go, I called my father for a ride back to the house where I had been continuing to stay. He tried to talk to me about what was happening, but I clammed up completely. I went straight to the room where I had been sleeping since my accident and only came out to shower and to eat a silent dinner with my parents. I laid there, the drugs still in my system helping me ease off into sleep. I woke in the middle of the night, my heart slamming against my ribs and chest bone. I sat up and wiped at the sweat coating my forehead and face. I glanced at the digital clock on the bedside table and found it was just before 2 in the morning. Earlier than usual, but I decided to go for a jog anyway. I got dressed quickly and set out, locking the door behind me. I started walking at first, at just a slightly faster pace than my casual stride, waiting until I rounded the corner to actually start trotting. My feet carried me through the neighborhood and out onto the same lonely country road where I had been struggling with suicidal thoughts. I was beginning to slow down, intending to stop in the middle of the crossroads where the stranger in the wide-brimmed hat had stood that night. But as my pace began to slow, I heard something growling behind me and slightly off the side of the road. I turned to see what had made the sound, and that's when my eyes picked out a dark shape in the tall grass, the flash of headlights reflecting back at me from a gap in the blades. As the car approached, a large black dog emerged from the gloom, lunging directly at me. I turned to run and was met by the car. Once again, all I felt was impact and a brief, floating feeling. I was numb and barely conscious when I hit the ground. The driver opened the door, and floating on the wind, I heard a familiar melody before I blacked out. I woke in severe agony and in traction again with the name of the song on the tip of my tongue. It was Robert Johnson's Hellhounds on my train. I visited the chapel the next day and only hope that I can be saved.